The ink's barely dry on Hong Kong's new national security law, and already it's all coming to a head. Hello, everyone. I'm François Picard. Welcome to the France 24 debate as the new sedition law takes effect there. The first arrests, the first books pulled from library shelves, and on Monday, Hong Kong police granted vastly expanded powers to conduct warrantless raids, surveillance, and issue internet takedown notices. US tech giants are split, with strong blowback from Facebook, Google, and Twitter, and so far cautious silence from Apple and Microsoft. The first casualty in this showdown could be TikTok, the China-owned short video app, which says it's to quit all operations in Hong Kong in the coming days. That may not be enough, though, to stop TikTok from escaping a ban on US soil, similar to the one announced last week by India. Once again, Hong Kong finds itself a pawn in a greater battle. How Western powers position themselves over a tiny former British colony that still remains the world's third largest financial center could set the tone for those bigger battles still to come. We'll ask our panel about the UK's offer of a path to citizenship for 3 million Hong Kong citizens, and after a year of turmoil and protest, whether this time we've seen the pro-democracy movement's last hurrah. Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at the latest from Hong Kong, and we're pleased to welcome from London Benedict Rogers, co-founder and chair of Hong Kong Watch. Thanks for being with us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
We also want to welcome from Beijing, Andy Mock, Senior Research Fellow at the Center for China and Globalization, CCG. Welcome to the show.
Great to be here.
From a former Beijing correspondent is with us as well. Jasper Becker, the author of Dragon Rising, an inside look at China today, formerly of the South China Morning Post. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
And from the French capital, Craig Capitas, correspondent at large for Quartz. How are you?
Good, Francois.
The France 24 debate on Facebook and on Twitter. The hashtag is F24debate. Now, that sedition law coming into effect, the pro-democracy movement, well, organizing itself as it can. Yuka Royer has more.
Just by holding blank sheets of paper, they're sending their message out. With sedition now being a crime punishable by up to life in prison, Hong Kong's pro-democracy activists have come up with creative ways to voice their dissent.
方式表達，就算行動上係真係削弱咗嘅，但係意志我哋係唔會減少噶嘛。只不過我哋要用另外一種方式，另一種更加聰明嘅方式嚟迴避政府嘅打壓。
A week since China's new national security law came into force, more details of the legislation have been released. Hong Kong's police have sweeping new powers, including searching property without a warrant and preventing people from leaving the Chinese enclave. Chief Executive Carrie Lam vowed to vigorously implement the new law.
And I forewarn those radicals not to attempt to violate this law or crossing the red line, because the consequences of breaching this law are very serious.
Schools and public libraries have already started pulling books written by pro-democracy figures like Joshua Wong. After his latest court appearance, the activist called for support from the international community.
With the risk of our personal safety, with the threat of life sentencing, we might be worried, but we also encourage the global community to let our voice be heard in the world.
Wong, along with fellow protest leaders Agnes Chow and Nathan Law, resigned from the pro-democracy group they co-founded after the new legislation came into force. It's also been revealed that Law has left Hong Kong to an unknown location.
Jasper Becker, when you hear the tone in that report of Carrie Lam, do you get the sense this time it really is it? It's that Tiananmen moment we were talking about for Hong Kong?
Yeah, it's pretty serious. It couldn't really get any worse, could it? And I think we're seeing really the end of Hong Kong as an independent city, and I think the future of Hong Kong as an independent financial center and a trading center is now going to be eroded It's been going that way slowly, but now it will sort of happen quite quickly, I think, because a lot of dominoes are going to fall in Hong Kong. I mean, it's propped up by a crazy property market. It's propped up by its special privileges under international treaties, and all this is going to go, and people are going to start leaving Hong Kong and cutting their ties and selling their properties. And I think this could, the whole thing could suddenly speed up very quickly. And it's really part of a pattern of actions by the Chinese government, by the Beijing government, to really defy the international community. I mean, we see this with the COVID panic, with the clashes in the border with India, and in many other areas. They're really sort of calling the West bluff, really.
Does Beijing still need Hong Kong?
I don't think it does. I think people in Hong Kong have overestimated their importance to the mainland, and I think in the context of the Chinese Communist Party's view of its sovereignty and its powers, they were never going to allow Hong Kong to be a sort of beacon of democracy, and to allow the residents of Hong Kong to defy the power of the Communist Party in the way that they've been doing over the past year since this latest round of democracy protests started in March last year. And I think, in their worldview, it's far more important to establish a monopoly of political control over the Chinese people than it is to nurture the prosperity of Hong Kong.
Andy Mark, do you agree with Jasper Beckett? It's all down, Jasper Becker. It's all downhill now for Hong Kong's status.
I actually completely disagree with everything that Jasper said. Respectfully, completely disagree. So I think, first of all, this is not the end of Hong Kong, but the beginning of Hong Kong. So we need to realize that Hong Kong never was an independent city. So it was a colony of Great Britain and then a territory. And when it gained, when the handover in 1997, it reverted back to the PRC. So I think it's completely false to call it an independent city. Second of all, I think that Hong Kong is vitally important to China, and that Hong Kong's best days are still ahead now that a lot of the foreign instigated rioting, sabotage has been put an end, or an end has been put to this.
Foreign instigated rioting by whom?
Foreign instigated rioting, I think, by people that I think have been misled, misguided, some perhaps naively, I think some perhaps maliciously, to cause trouble, to disrupt Hong Kong with a larger aim of, I think, creating complications for China. But let me continue here. So I think that Hong Kong's best days are ahead, because what made Hong Kong valuable commercially, put aside the lives of the 7 million people there, but what's made Hong Kong successful, there's only one thing, one word that made Hong Kong successful and continues to make Hong Kong successful, and that's China. Because when we look at what made Hong Kong so important, it was because it was the window, the single entry point into China at the beginning of economic reform and opening in 1978. And Hong Kong's economy, the prosperity of the Hong Kong people exploded because of that. And I think that's not going to change.
But Andrew Mark, on that point, the business people are pragmatic. they want to do business somewhere where they know they can trust the rules, they can trust the courts. If they don't trust the courts, if they don't trust the legal system anymore, can they still do business there?
Oh, absolutely. So, first of all, we have to recognize that Hong Kong certainly has efficiencies when it comes to global business, largely because of the legacy, its colonial legacy, in that the English language, the British legal system has become the de facto global standard. And of course, with the transition of global hegemony from Great Britain to the US, we've largely maintained that. So that all exists. And I think that reduces the cost of doing business for global businesses in Hong Kong. Rule of law still exists. And again, when we think of rule of law, we can think of there is a human rights aspect to this, but there is also a commercial contractual rights aspect to this. And I think that the business side of it has been impacted not at all. I mean, of course, there's been some questions about business confidence, but I think that's misplaced. And in fact, the biggest hit to business confidence was not the national security law, but again, the protests, the riots, the instability in Hong Kong that, if left to continue, truly would have destroyed Hong Kong.
Benedict Rogers, you agree?
I entirely disagree with Andy Marr, and I very much agree with Jasper Becker. Hong Kong Watch published a report earlier this year called Why Hong Kong Matters. And one of the things we found through researching that report, and we talked to a lot of business interests in Hong Kong, was that what makes Hong Kong special as an international business center, yes, of course, China's important, but what really makes it special is the rule of law, the independence of the judiciary, the transparency, the confidence for business people, leave aside pro-democracy people, but business people, that if they criticize or somehow fall out with the Chinese Communist Party in Hong Kong, their businesses, their assets are secure up until now. And I think all of these things are dramatically eroded as a result of this new law. And I think we will see businesses either coming under pressure from Beijing, as we've seen with HSBC and Standard Chartered, really with a gun held to their heads to support the law, or we'll see people leaving the city.
Again, I hark back to the report we saw at the outset. What's the future for those pro-democracy activists?
The future is very bleak. Either they have three options, really. They choose to continue to fight and end up in prison, potentially for life. They abandon their struggle and go quiet, or at least go more subtle and more creative underground, but still at great risk. Or they leave the city and continue the struggle internationally. But all of those options are not good options for them.
Craig Capitas, when you look at the events of the past 24 hours, you have these new sweeping powers for the police, and there's been blowback immediately from tech giants. Facebook issuing a statement saying that it's pausing the review of government requests for user data from Hong Kong, pending further assessment of the impact of the national security law, including formal human rights due diligence and consultations with human rights experts. We've heard similar language from the likes of Google, Twitter. Do you get the sense that already the business community is voting with its feet?
No, they're not. I mean, that's an awful lot of words to have Facebook and all the tech giants clutch their pearls. They sound like Susan Collins, the senator from Maine. Oh, my dear. Look, every successful revolt is termed a revolution, and every unsuccessful one, a rebellion, as Andy said, of the misguided. The problem is, what side are you going to take in Hong Kong? Are you going to take the side of the corporate, or are you going to take the side of democracy? As far as HSBC and the other big banks, Paribas, having a gun put to their heads, I'd say no, it's just the opposite. Not only do they want the gun there, they're providing the ammunition for those weapons. HSBC, for example, publicly declared its support for the new legislation in June before the details were even released. BNP Paribas, HSBC, a whole lot of other companies have a hell of a lot of money invested in there. And as far as this theory, which is, I think, poppycock, that people aren't going to want to go to Hong Kong, a recent report by ECA Human Resources, along with some others, say that China remains the most common destination globally for companies to send their staff to. So there is going to be an increase there. You might see some short-term problems in the banking sector, but people want long-term stability. Corporations want long-term stability.
And when Jasper Becker,
all the world's umbrellas are made in China, and nobody wants to get wet. So until Apple and all the tech companies shut down their operations in China and shut down their stores in Hong Kong, it's going to be more of the same, and the Chinese Communist Party wins.
and the fact that Apple and Microsoft, by the way, full disclosure, this is a pre-record, so maybe they will have made a statement by the time this airs. But Craig Kapitas, the fact that Apple and Microsoft have not yet issued a statement, what does that tell you, Craig?
It tells me they're not going to issue a statement. It tells me they're going to clutch their pearls and they're going to keep doing business, along with all the other companies. Yes, there's going to be embargoes. But, you know, as Charles de Gaulle said, you know, embargoes are like roses and young girls. They last while they last. And they are going to go in that direction. There will be near-term disruption, but long-term success. The democracy backers have been defenestrated by the Chinese Communist Party. That's just the way it is. And until, you know, I drove by Paris-Bas on Friday. I didn't see any protesters out front there. That's where you should be protesting. Protesters should be at the HSBC board of directors meeting, shareholders meeting. They're not there because all of those major corporations are going to stay there. And if they have to pay fines, as they have in the past, that money is chump changed and it's already ring fenced by the companies.
Jasper Becker.
And if I may.
Go ahead, Benedict Rogers.
Well, I disagree with what's just been said. I think that Chris Patten used a very good phrase, the last governor of Hong Kong, when he said that the Chinese Communist Party has treated the banks in the way that a sort of mafia boss would treat people. I think the banks were given an ultimatum, and that's why they came out in support of the law. I don't think they really would have done so. I mean, usually banks don't take a position on political and human rights issues, but to come out in support of something that so decimates Hong Kong's basic freedoms and autonomy was extraordinary, and I don't think they would have done that without pressure.
And to Craig Kapitas' point that you're not seeing picketers outside of HSBC's headquarters?
Well, I think time will tell whether we do in the days and weeks to come. I mean, one of the tragedies of this situation is that it's happened at a time when the world has a lot of other things going on, and not least, you know, in many places it's still not possible to gather in large numbers because of the pandemic. So that may be why we're not seeing mass protests. But I think over time we may see shareholders and customers really questioning the banks. We're already seeing the British Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab criticizing them, members of Parliament doing so, and let's see what happens in the weeks ahead. Jasper Becker,
your thoughts on this?
If I may, look, usually banks don't take issue. If the past 3 years have shown us anything in the upheavals around the world, isn't it about time that the banks take a position on this, because so many lives are at stake? Because banks at their core, and capitalism operates best under a democracy. There's a lot of whistling past the graveyard going on here now. And I do not see the banks at any point, or any of the big financial service companies, saying anything that is going to disrupt the totalitarians in charge of the Chinese Communist Party. It's bad for business.
I'd like to make 2 points about that. I think Craig, you know, I agree with what Craig said about the banks, but especially the tech companies. And I think the tech companies fear another Jerry Yang experience. So many in our audience may be too young to remember this, but Yahoo Jerry Yang, who's one of the co-founders of Yahoo, was dragged in front of US Congress, humiliated and excoriated for following PRC law. And I think that many tech companies, the Microsofts, the Facebooks, have learned a lesson that if they can, it's best to avoid being caught in this no-win situation. So I think it makes sense that they're keeping quiet for now. And will they continue to keep quiet, I think remains to be seen.
Well, it's Microsoft and Apple that are keeping quiet. It's not Facebook. It's Facebook.
Okay, I'm sorry. Yes. Thank you for pointing that out. The other point, though, is that is democracy truly a better system for capitalism? I think it's hard to say. And I think we're increasingly seeing that democracy certainly is not the better system for ordinary people. I would say let's look at, if we ask an average citizen in the UK or the United States, so these are held out as the premier democracies, are your lives better 20 years ago than they were today? I'm not sure they would say yes. If we ask
but when you come
a Chinese
in and
person,
burning books, you have a problem. You do
sorry,
not
if I can
burn
finish.
books.
If I can finish.
Books in Hong Kong.
All right, one at a time.
Let me finish. If we ask the average Chinese person, I think if we asked any Chinese person, I think the answer would be universal. Their lives are far, far better. And let me share one statistic with you. In 2007, China's economy and the UK's economy were about equal. Today, China's economy is about 10 times that of the UK. Now, we can say life is much more than just economics or money, and that's true. But what's important to point out here is many other important quality of life indicators correlate with this.
But you had 1 million people in the streets of Hong Kong last June, a year ago, who didn't want that system, it seems.
Sure. Absolutely. So, but my point here, though, is that to Craig's point, that is democracy in fact best for capitalism, and is it even best for ordinary people? I don't think that we can say yes. I think this is a debatable proposition. Why were there so many people on the streets in Hong Kong last year? I think there's a couple reasons for this. Certainly, there are some people that genuinely believe, rightly or wrongly, that democracy indeed is a better system. I think many others were stampeded into believing or acting on this, in my view, erroneous belief. And
right, let me bring in Jasper Becker on this, because we have. I'd love to hear your views, having been formerly based over there. Your thoughts on it?
Well, I think the Chinese Communist Party has successfully threatened people inside China, and they're now threatening people in Hong Kong. And I think people will be scared to do business in Hong Kong, because they can be arbitrarily arrested and taken to China and sentenced to a long prison term. And remember, almost anyone who runs a significant business in China is controlled by the party secretary in his company, who is answerable to the party in Beijing. And so any commercial dispute actually involves confronting members of the Communist Party who have a special status and who now have their own secret police operating in Hong Kong. It's impossible to see how people will have confidence to remain in Hong Kong and continue doing business there. Secondly, I think the key thing is under the treaty, people were promised one country, two systems. They were promised the right to elect their chief executive directly, and China has not honored its international commitments under this, and this is a terrible signal which China is sending out to the rest of the world. It's basically telling people it cannot be trusted with international agreements. It's secondly telling people you're either with us or you're against us. And so you're effectively declaring to the outside world that we are intending to do things exactly our way and as we please. And I think a lot of these banks and tech companies have been encouraged to go into China on the assumption that China was moving towards having an independent judiciary and adhering to international norms in many spheres, and that it was, and we were told by many politicians like former President Clinton that China was on the way to becoming a democracy. And this engagement policy, which has underpinned Western relations with China since the late 1970s, is now at an end. And I think people are going to recognize this. And this is a significant turning point, because a lot of people didn't want to recognize that this engagement policy had failed. And the events in Hong Kong and in other areas are making people confront this fact. And here in the UK, we're having this dispute about whether Huawei should be allowed to build our 5G system. And the pressure is on the government to turn its back on Huawei. And I think those kind of decisions in many areas are going to have huge ramifications, because China basically wants to build up its own international system with its own allies, its own internet system, its own banking system, its own standards. And so this period of cooperation with China is now coming to an end, and we're going to see a sort of reorganization of international relations as a consequence of this.
Yeah, that brings us to the question of the European reaction. This week here in France, there was a disclaimer put on the licenses granted to telecoms giant Huawei. They would be 8-year licenses, a limited scope. All that's been revised downward, as it has been in the UK. We saw in the House of Commons on Monday, members of Parliament from Boris Johnson's own party asking that Hong Kong's chief executive, Carrie Lam, be put on the equivalent of a Magnitsky Act list. The Magnitsky Act is a list of people who are under sanctions for human rights violations from Russia and the United States. And we heard strong reaction. It's always about the messaging from the Chinese ambassador to the UK. Let's listen.
We want to be your friend. We want to be your partner. But if you want to make China a hostile country, you have to bear the consequences.
If you want to make China a hostile country, you have to bear the consequences. Your reaction to that messaging, Craig Capitas?
If you're a democracy, you bear the consequences. But can you? I look at that, and the first thing that comes to mind is I cannot see the U.S. ambassador to China or any American diplomat being allowed on Chinese Communist Party controlled state television to say the same thing to the Chinese people. It is so disingenuous, and quite frankly, if Europe and the West were so concerned about Huawei, what they would immediately do is invest heavily and immediately in Ericsson and Nokia, which makes the same type of equipment, and just avoid Huawei altogether. But they won't do that. You hear a lot of talk about it, but it's not done. And the reason goes back to the money. The Chinese make stuff, it's good stuff, and they make it cheaper.
Benedict Rogers, you agree?
I do agree largely with that last point. I think that we absolutely should be prioritizing both our values and our national security. And I think Huawei is a serious threat to both. But we have to make a choice as societies. Are we going to focus on short-term money issues or longer-term values and national security? I think in regard to the European response and the British response that you've described, I think we are starting to see a change of mindset. Only a few months ago, the British government was talking about the golden era of Sino-British relations. Now, because of the situation in Hong Kong, also because of the pandemic and the way the Chinese regime handled the very beginnings of that, in both cases, we're seeing the Chinese Communist Party breaks its promises, is mendacious, cannot be trusted.
And on that point, is the UK in a position to lecture China? It's the former colonial power. Human rights advocates say it was never that big on democracy when it was there. And the idea of offering this path to citizenship for 3 million people, Benedict, the argument's been made that that's not supporting Hong Kong, that's encouraging a brain drain.
Well, I agree with some of that. Certainly, our history with Hong Kong is, you can point to all sorts of things that we should have done that I'm critical that we didn't do. But what we did do for Hong Kong, even though it wasn't a democracy, is that we did leave behind the values of the rule of law and basic freedoms short of democracy. Most importantly, we signed the Sino-British Joint Declaration, which is an international treaty lodged at the UN, valid for 50 years from the time of the handover, and we're less than halfway through the lifespan of that treaty. On the BNO question, I agree largely with the premise of your point that what we should be doing is mobilizing the entire international community to put pressure on Beijing to make this decision about the national security law very costly for Beijing, and in the hope of making it possible for Hong Kong to continue with the autonomy and the freedoms that it was promised. But the reality is it's changing very rapidly. There will be people who will need or want to flee, and we need to be prepared to help them, both through the BNO offer and through a wider lifeboat rescue scheme for those who aren't BNOs. But that should be the last resort, not the first response.
Andy Mark, just to be clear, that treaty that Benedict talked about from 1997, is it still valid?
I think the idea, the framework behind it absolutely is valid. And again, I think there is a lot of debate, and it's a very polarized issue. From my point of view, I think that the one country, two systems agreement is firmly in place and is being honored and implemented in a very effective way. And again, we need to remember that we have contracts, we have laws. Not the purpose of humanity is not to obey laws. The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So that when we look at the future of Hong Kong, I mean, why do we have these agreements? It's for the good of the people of Hong Kong. So I think as long as they are benefiting and improving, and of course we're debating here, are they or how much are they? But I would say, in fact, yes, the agreement is being honored. I want to go back to this point too, that would the US speak in another country like this? Perhaps not, but what they might do is send an aircraft carrier or maybe launch a few Tomahawk missiles. Or as Teddy Roosevelt said, speak softly but carry a big stick. Now, what did he mean by that? Of course, meaning using force, using violence to achieve diplomatic ends. So
no, what Craig Kapita said was would the U.S. ambassador to China be allowed to make that statement on CCTV?
Mm-hmm. Sure. I think that's a very good question. I don't know, but what I have to say is that the media in China is a very different animal in terms of its function, its purpose is very, very different from the media in the West. So to expect two different forms of life, if you will, that just happen to share the same name, but do function in very significantly different ways. To do the same thing, I think, is not a very useful way of thinking about it.
Jasper Becker, how does that bode for your former employer, the South China Morning Post, and the other publications out of Hong Kong?
Yes, it's very interesting to look back at the history of Hong Kong as a special place in the Chinese world, because it was for the last 120, 100 and even longer, the only place where you could actually speak freely and publish what you wanted. In mainland China and in Taiwan, you were under the thumb of either the CCP or the KMT. And Hong Kong therefore played a very special role in Chinese history, where all the different ruling factions in China had a safe place where they could meet and interact and exchange information and ideas and negotiate. And that role of Hong Kong in Chinese history has now come to an end. And therefore, the free press in Hong Kong is now going to be under the thumb of the Chinese Communist Party. You're not allowed to say anything or do anything which would threaten the interests of the Chinese Communist Party. So, if you go back to the Cultural Revolution, Hong Kong was the one place where even the Chinese Communist Party could put out some message, and different factions of the Communist Party could release information that gave you some idea of what was going on in this very secretive society and this very secretive party. And so Hong Kong's, although it's quite small, was tremendously important. And it's very sad to see that come to an end, because there's now no space apart from Taiwan where you can actually speak freely about Chinese issues.
All right, we're running short on time. There's one tech company that we did not mention earlier, and that's the popular social media video sharing site TikTok for those short videos. TikTok, which has a US CEO, its servers are backed up in Singapore, but its parent company, ByteDance, is Chinese. In fact, it's the world's most valuable startup, according to reports. Now, the U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo Monday, speaking to Fox News, said there's a chance that the U.S. could follow the example of what India did last week, which was announced there would soon be a ban on TikTok.
Your viewers should know we're taking this very seriously. We're certainly looking at it. We've worked on this very issue for a long time, whether it was the problems of having Huawei technology in your infrastructure. We've gone all over the world, and we're making real progress getting that out. We declared ZTE a danger to American national security. We've done all of these things with respect to Chinese apps on people's cell phones. I can assure you the United States will get this one right too, Laura. I don't want to get out in front of the president, but it's something we're looking at.
Your reaction, Craig Kapitas?
Well, first of all, I don't believe, a few million or tens of millions of teenagers in the United States putting up social, videos is going to have any influence on foreign policy. As for TikTok being the most valuable digital company right now, well, that's until next week and another one comes along. As far as TikTok, they only have 150,000 users in Hong Kong, and it's not profitable there. I think TikTok is a feint. It's a dodge. It's really a so what. What you have to look at are the big ones, as you mentioned before, Francois, Facebook and Google. And I think the question you have to ask is, who needs China more, Facebook, or does China need Facebook more than the other way around? And I don't think China needs Facebook. China doesn't need Apple. They're very happy to go it on their own. And wouldn't lose any sleep over losing any Western high-tech company.
But on the issue of TikTok, Craig, isn't it important, again, from a messaging point of view, from a public relations point of view, or if we're going to talk like wonks, a soft power point of view?
It's past that point, Francois. Soft power is over. The Chinese Communist Party has taken over Hong Kong. All that we're seeing here now is some sort of kabuki dance that really is meaningless. The Chinese government in Beijing, the Politburo, the People's Liberation Army, and all their apparatus is now in control of Hong Kong. And woe be the people who live in Hong Kong who want a democracy. Because the question was really very simple. Under the treaty and everything our guests have spoken about, why didn't the Chinese just hold an election and have someone other than them count the votes? Find out what Hong Kong wanted to do. But no, they didn't want to do that because they want to put their thumb over Hong Kong. They want to control the place. And guess what? They've accomplished it.
But Craig, if I can briefly make a response to that, implicit in your statement is that democracy is the best form of government. And again, I think that is a very questionable proposition. Second, the people that are complaining the most about this really are centered in kind of a white supremacist, if I may use that term, ideology. It's the countries of the Five Eyes. If we look around the world, look at the UN, the number of countries that have supported China's national security law for Hong Kong far outnumber the countries that oppose.
We're almost out of time, so just...
Sure, but I just wanted to point out that observation that this is another way we can understand this polarization.
Benedict Rogers, in less than 30 seconds, your response?
It's hard to see how Japan is a white supremacist country. It's hard to see how Taiwan, which has been an outstanding example of democracy and an outstanding example of a place handling the pandemic, hard to see Taiwan as white supremacists.
Sure, not everyone. American vassal states fall in that category.
There's much more to talk about. We could go on for much longer. I want to thank so much Benedict Rogers and Jasper Becker in London, Andy Mock in Beijing, Craig Koupidis in Paris. We want to thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate. Much more on our website, france24.com. Bye for now.
France 24, every art form.
Liberté, égalité, actualité.